As we move into the 20th century, a lot of debunking takes place. That's been referred to among professionals as the engaging in the hermeneutics of suspicion. This means that high and noble ideas, notions of truth, beauty, and goodness, which are meant to be lofty and somehow to elevate us, are viewed suspiciously and interpreted as probably having base origins and maybe as being illusions, not necessarily part of the childhood of the human race, but at least ideas that perhaps as we become fully mature, we can see for what they are, arising out of lower elements in us and not having that extraordinary, transforming, elevating, higher value that earlier in our development we ascribe to them. Take a moment to think about what we said earlier about Hegel. Here was the notion of a history that had been lived through, the history of the development of the human spirit, and we could understand it and be elevated by it. We could say by the time our life ended that we'd understood the various stages that the human spirit had gone through. Maybe we hadn't been there, but we saw how they connected. For example, we could look at paintings from the medieval period, feel into what it must have been like then, and through Hegel understand what life meant then and what it was moving toward then. Well, when we get into the 20th century, and a number of thinkers contribute to this, and we saw Nietzsche's contribution to it, we have a vast lowering of expectations. Simply put, there's virtually no worry about whether there's a life after death. The worry is whether there's a life after birth, a life after birth that we can reconcile ourselves to and get some enjoyment from. Now, the notion that there's a goal to human life and a right way to journey toward this goal, we've seen how that's been recurrent in both philosophical and psychological guides to living. And this axial model about life as a movement from appearance to reality, a movement from bondage to liberation, from darkness to light, well, that has been fundamental for centuries and centuries in the quest for meaning. And in fact, Nietzsche saying God is dead is part of the end of the confidence in that. And Freud talking about the way we arose through primal hordes is another attack on that model. The perennial model was provided through Plato, and it required another world available through intelligence and reason, maybe a competitor to the religious. Stress got put on a lesser part of our nature that we needed to put in order, not necessarily altogether suppress, but certainly put in its place. And human life in some other world then got construed as something that would come later, as many religions have thought, and might be permanent and something we could aspire to long after this life ended, or it could be viewed as a fleeting reality that we could glimpse by the use of our minds. And then, of course, there were Christian appropriations, for example, of this perennial philosophy. And then the other world became more substantial and active, and this world became under judgment of a negative sort, that this world was a place of sin and another world was a place of salvation. And redeemer figures show up in various religions that actively intervene in this world and bring grace. And on many of these models, the fundamental human drives get construed as sinful. And we see that as much as anywhere in a philosopher like Augustine. The movement of depth psychology in the 20th century has involved the attempt largely to deny the axial model that we've been exploring, if it means belief in the existence of another world. But depth psychology has also tried to rehabilitate and reaffirm various drives that the axial model had put into question. Freud and others are concerned about delayed gratification. That is, delayed gratification that is illusory and oppressive. And Freud and many of his followers wanted us to find ways directly to enjoy ourselves. Freud, in fact, talked after seeing a performance of the opera Carmen about how it was too bad that people couldn't just enjoy life, that they couldn't just allow their passions and their diversity to be seen more as fonts of enjoyment. And why should people restrain and delay gratifying themselves because life had so little to offer? Questions emerge in our time, many questions regarding whether economic concerns may replace religious ones as unwitting instruments of tyranny. Prior to the work of, well, many people in the last 50 years, it's been thought that religion has been the oppressor, and it's been the religious that has restrained us. And freedom from religious commands might be the way to go. But what turns out to be the case over the last half century is there have been growing worries that the dominance of economic models and economic imperatives about productivity and gross national product and how much one must do, and financial matters might also become a kind of tyranny. In the classical period of depth psychology, there was a controversy over the nature of what supposedly our fundamental drives were and whether one was in some particular way dominant. As we know, Freud focused on sexuality, very much the sort of focus Schopenhauer had. Following Nietzsche, a psychoanalyst named Alfred Adler took power, the will to power, the urge to dominate, to be the fundamental drive. And in wide-ranging and often diffuse ways, Carl Gustav Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist, took the quest for meaning. He's our guy. The quest for meaning to be central and determining of other and all other drives. It's not simply a matter of finding the satisfying, it's a matter of finding the meaningful. And the idea was the satisfying and the meaningful might not just altogether be the same thing. Important to all these thinkers is the notion of sublimation, what we might call substitute satisfaction. It comes to play a very large role in depth psychological reflections. Sublimation suggests that there are problematic features of human motivation that require some kind of management. For example, hostile and aggressive impulses come to be recognized as inherent, as not together eradicable, and then the question becomes, well, what do you do with them? You sublimate them. You don't hit the boss in the face. You find some substitute way of dealing with the boss. Now, I leave that to you and I leave that to me, but the notion is that sublimation is finding an indirect and acceptable way of releasing aggression, disappointed feelings, anger that will not cause direct retaliation. And on these models, our underlying psychological life is also construed as, in some ways, impersonal, and in other ways is blind to certain kind of very personal notions. There's a story that I can tell you in this regard that I think is a very helpful one. It comes from a Canadian novelist whose name is Robertson Davies. And the novel is called Fifth Business. And it illustrates in very important ways notions that we find in Carl Jung about meaning. And I want us to dwell with those notions for a few moments. In this particular novel, we're told the story of a young man who, in battle and out of fear, runs. And the next thing is that he wakes up finding himself in a hospital. And he discovers that he is being labeled a hero. This surprises him, because all he can remember was that he was in battle and he ran. He was afraid. There was probably a shell that was fired. He was knocked unconscious. And the next thing he knew, he was in a hospital, and he's being told that he was being awarded a special medal for his heroism. He keeps quiet about this because he thinks it's awful to say, "Aw, shucks, I really didn't do anything." And probably being human like the rest of us, he didn't want to say, "Oh, I was just frightened to death and I got up and ran." What he does is keep mum about this matter, but he goes to the ceremony where he is to be presented with the medal. And a member of the royalty presents him with the medal. And as he comes up to get it, solemnly and politely, he looks in the face of the member of the royalty who's bestowing the medal, and he thinks to himself, this man probably thinks it's equally odd that he is somebody called royalty, as it's odd for me to think that I'm someone labeled a hero. But after all, it is just part of the way our psyche works that all of us need royalty and heroes, and somebody's got to do it. Now, the member of the royal family who presents the medal is the royalty, and our man who ran frightened and became unconscious, found himself in the hospital, became the hero. But in the novel, Robertson's Davies' notion is that there are needs for heroes, needs for royalty, needs for villains, needs for heroines, needs for all kinds of different types of people, so that we are not just individuals. We are also, to some other people, embodiments of types. And we should realize that our lives are not just personal, they are impersonal as well. So unlike Freud, who thought of transference in very specifically personal situations where we replay and replay and replay things from our past, Jung, with respect to his notion of the development of meaning, says we are also, at least to some other people, playing roles that those people need to see played. And we have other people in our lives who are playing roles for us. And part of psychological liberation is to realize that roles are always being played. They need not be viewed as phony, but they are roles that our human psyche needs. And part of psychological liberation is realizing this. Sublimation also captures and provides a partial explanation and justification of both creativity and culture. Freud's famous, but also notorious example of artists whom he says pursue fame, honor, and the love of women is a reductive explanation, but his explanation of creative life. Simply put, why do artists create? It's not because they are inspired by some otherworldly notion or that some great vision comes to them. It's more that they have a talent and they think that maybe a success they can have with women, with getting honors, with becoming famous, might be achieved in that way. So that's a substitute satisfaction, not a direct way to their real goal, which would be sexual, fame, aggrandizement of themselves. And from Freud's point of view, culture then gets construed as a disguised and derivative means of coming to terms with deep urges, ambitions, and culture is the playground, the battlefield on which those matters get worked out. But we should look further into what happens after Freud, because a number of ideas emerge that are of considerable significance. There's a school of thought in psychoanalytic theory called object relations, which is a departure in some respects from Freud. In fact, both object relations and family-centered accounts of the human situation have challenged the more individually oriented and classical psychological theories. In fact, a divide arose between intrapsychic and interpersonal accounts of human needs. The classical model, which we got from Freud and was followed by his daughter Anna Freud, stressed the intrapsychic, that is, that which is just simply inside us, and is the drives, the urges, the instincts, the desires we have that are within us and then play themselves out. The object relation school, which is associated primarily with Melanie Klein, put more emphasis on the need for connectedness and the fact that as human beings, it is in our nature to be connected, and understands humans more and more in terms of the earliest connectedness, which of course is in terms of the mother, the fact that we are in various ways from the time of birth separated, the fact that in every separation there's a little bit of adventure and a little bit of uplift, but every separation as part of the journey of life involves a little bit of fear, so we want to be able to return, we want to separate, we want to adventure, we want to turn and make sure we could come back if we wanted to come back. There's always that feeling that in some way we also need to be reunited. Let's look further into this. In terms of the model that we have primarily looked at, the journey of life is a journey toward another place, a place beyond that we have been displaced from, that would be our true home. But now we have a different model, a psychological model, in terms of which at least part of what we mean by home is the place from which we began, from which we venture, that place out of which we arose. And our relation is always one of wanting a reunion, a coming back home. And we can only fully adventure if we can think there is a route back home, but we can only come home if we know we can venture. So there's always the notion of moving out, turning, returning, moving out differently, returning, turning. And part of the psychological health we achieve is through that turning out and returning. The notion of a family nexus opened further the original insularity of classical theory, and on such accounts that often we see in family-oriented therapies, what humans get to be seen as is parts of communication systems. And it's often the case that human families are viewed as communication systems that involve scrambled messages and hung-up receivers. And the notion from that comes that you could never deal with an individual because an individual is always connected in some kind of nexus. So you would have to have some form of group therapy because we are not just separate, we are connected. It's a little like Hegel's notion that how we see ourselves is dependent on how others see us, and we internalize the way others see us, and that becomes part of ourselves. So you almost have to bring the whole family in and get the communication system straightened out if any one member of the family is going to become healthy. Significant recent work has been done by a school of thought which is sometimes referred to as self-psychology. And an importance is given to what is termed internalization. Some refer to it as introjection. Understandings of ourselves are often construed as the result of early incorporations of the attitudes toward ourselves adopted by significant others. Let me pause on this for a moment to let us brood on it. Is it true that how I see myself, how you see yourself, is partly the result of how those closest to you in your earliest years, in your infancy, saw you and treated you? And that if part of you is how you see yourself, and part of how you see yourself is how those earliest people in your life saw you, then is it the case that part of you is that inner picture you have of yourself that came from early on, that you're living with and may not be altogether aware of? Is it possible that that inner picture that has come to be yours without you knowing it may be restrictive, may oppress or constrict rather than open up opportunity for you? The School of Self-Psychology is very interested in finding ways to transmute, that is to say, change such internalizations or such introjections. And the changing of them is viewed as central to the development of an authentic understanding of who we are. Now, a great controversy has emerged over the relative value of something called interpretation and an approach which is more recent and is called the approach of empathy. Classical psychoanalysis was very caught up in the notion of interpretation. The psychoanalyst would interpret what the underlying drives were that you had. The psychoanalyst would interpret what defenses you might be using, unknown to you, to keep yourself from fully and probably painfully experiencing those drives. The empathy school, which is part of self-psychology, takes a different tack. It says it's far less important that interpretation takes place. What is important, and let's linger on this, what is important is that a certain empathic environment is engendered. An illustration of this is what you would do if you were a doctor and you arrived late to see your patient. Would you say, "I'm sorry I'm late"? That would seem to be the nice empathic thing to do. The empathy school says, yes, that's what you should do. The interpretation school says, you say nothing, because what's all important is the patient's reaction. So empathy is taken as one alternative way. It is taken as a way that provides a supportive environment and a mode of revealing by which the therapist is said to reach a deeper understanding of the patient's problems. In fact, there's an interesting account of this in Hermann Hesse, who is a German writer who won the Nobel Prize in the 20th century, and particularly in a novel of his called Siddhartha. In this novel, there is someone called the ferryman. What the ferryman does, among other things, is listen to people. And the thought is, if the ferryman, in a very supportive, empathic way, listens, then eventually, whoever talks will have come to tell his or her story. And having told his or her story, that person will be relieved, will be assuaged, in partial ways will be healed. The issue is not interpreting what someone deeply beneath their consciousness may have in mind or mean. The notion is that the empathic environment allows one to tell a story that, in the telling of which, one now experiences a release of pressure. What about a therapeutic culture? Whether it's a therapeutic culture of interpreting underlying drives, or a therapeutic culture where what is most important is providing an empathic environment so that people can tell their stories, discover, in fact, what their stories are. Well, a therapeutic culture is one that understands the meaning of life issues largely in ways that don't have to do with a journey from here to any beyond. The notion of transcendence, which we have looked at so frequently, it's largely ignored. Though, unlike Freud, many of adept psychologists think that religion can in important ways be part of our lives. Nonetheless, it is thought that we have to find more and more ways to live and dwell in the present, ways in which we can better be in the world, and that the world here should define our concerns. It should be a world, for instance, where we realize that we are not just individuals, but we play roles, and that the people we are with are not just individuals, they also play roles. And ways in which we may not be altogether of the world, not altogether of the world, tend to get construed as pathologies. as misunderstandings, perhaps as substitute satisfactions. An important distinction gets made, and I'd like to take a moment and dwell on this with you. The distinction is between something we might call pathological anxiety and something we'll call ontological anxiety. Pathological anxiety is viewed as something that needs to be cured. Ontological anxiety is viewed perhaps as an appropriate recognition that life is something strange, precious, and precarious. The tendency of the psychological movement and of depth psychology is to say that, generally speaking, anxiety should be viewed as a pathological phenomenon, and to as great a degree as possible, we should find ways to alleviate it, to cure it. We will soon be looking at the notion that perhaps there is anxiety that is appropriate, should not be cured, and any attempt to cure it would remove part of the wonder and the mystery that makes us human beings. It should not be called pathological. It should be thought of as ontological, that is, related to our being. And that's an important distinction in anxiety that we think we should rid ourselves of with help, or in anxiety which we think is good to cultivate if it doesn't overwhelm us, because it has to do with a fundamental fact about us, that we are here, not sure if we might not belong elsewhere, and that there's something precarious, precious, wonderful, strange, and inexplicable about human life. What happens as we move through the 20th century, which some say is a century in which psychoanalytic thinking had its birth, and a century in which psychoanalytic thinking may well be nearing its end? What we see happening is that enjoyment and productivity concerns become dominant concerns. And with the psychological model, the concern is to find ways to help us be more productive and to enjoy life more. And the problem is to find ways to negotiate the gaps between underlying desires and realistic, non-destructive possibilities. We've got to recognize what our desires are. We've got to realize that in many cases they can't be realistically satisfied. We have to find productive, non-destructive ways of dealing with them. And what often happens on this model is that therapies become the handmaidens of productivity concerns, sometimes concerns for self-esteem. At an earlier time, one's image of oneself might have come from a metaphysical picture of reality, or one's picture of oneself might have come from an account of one's life as being part, for example, of a Western heritage, or one's picture of oneself might have come from a model of a kind of religious reality of which we could be a child, a spark, a part. But as these psychological models we've been looking at become more and more dominant, what we come to see ourselves in the image of is people very much in this world, in many ways frustrated, with a certain number of opportunities, concerned to alleviate the pressure of desires that are not altogether realistic, trying to find ways to be more and more productive, trying to find ways to make proper compromises, shrewd compromises with our total life situation. There is a deflation that we find in this. We no longer find the place of our true belonging or think a great deal about the meaning of life. What we think of is easing our circumstances, meaning coming to better terms with what we discover within us, and promoting our circumstances in the sense of finding more and more ways to be productive. And therapy, which some have claimed has become an alternative to religion and even to philosophy, becomes a means for better and better management of our person. The meaning of life turns into an adjustment to the realities of living.